February 26, 1991. The Mutla Ridge region, near the Kuwaiti-Iraqi border. Time: 2:30 in the morning. The desert, usually a vast expanse of scorched silence, had turned into a suffocating closet. A violent storm system had moved in from the Persian Gulf, bringing with it a torrential downpour that turned the sand into a slurry of thick, clinging mud. But the rain was not the primary enemy. The true enemy was the fog. It was a dense, heavy soup mixed with the oily smoke of burning oil wells to the south, reducing visibility to less than 50 meters. For the crew of the Iraqi Republican Guard, dug deep into defensive berms along the phase line known as Objective Norfolk, this weather was not a curse. It was a blessing. It was a shield. For 38 days, the coalition air forces had rained fire from the sky. The MiG-25 aircraft and MiG-29 fighters of the Iraqi Air Force had been swept aside or grounded, leaving the ground troops naked to the B-52 bombers and the precision-guided munitions of the West. But tonight, the sky was silent. The ceiling was too low for close air support. The Apache helicopters were grounded. The satellites were blind. For the first time in weeks, the playing field felt level. Major Al-Tikriti, commanding a battalion within the elite Tawakalna mechanized division of the Republican Guard, stared out of the cupola of his command vehicle. He could barely see the outline of the T-72 tank dug in 30 meters to his left. He felt a grim confidence. The Republican Guard was not the conscript army surrendering in droves to the south. These were the hardened veterans of the Iran-Iraq War. They had spent 8 years mastering the art of the defensive ambush. They knew this terrain. They knew that in this pitch-black, storm-ridden night, no army could move in formation. No army could navigate the featureless desert without landmarks. Any attacking force would have to stumble blindly into their kill zones, right into the sights of their 125mm guns. The plan was simple. Let the Americans come. Let them get close. In this soup, the American technological advantage, their radios, their satellites, their planes, was nullified. This would be a knife fight in a dark room. And in a knife fight, the man who knows the room wins. Then, the radio crackled. It was not a scream. It was a question. The commander of the 3rd Company, positioned on the far left flank of the defensive line, spoke with a trembling voice. "Sir, we've lost Vehicle 4. Al-Tikriti frowned, pressing the headset to his ear against the drumming of the rain. "Lost? Did they throw a track? Is it the engine?" "No, sir. It is gone." "Explain yourself," Al-Tikriti barked. "It exploded, sir. 1 second it was there. The next, the turret was airborne. Total catastrophic kill." Al-Tikriti scanned the horizon, pitch black. No flash of artillery, no sound of a jet engine, no whine of an incoming missile, just the wind and the rain. "Artillery barrage?" he asked, though he knew the answer. An artillery shell heavy enough to decapitate a T-72 tank would have shaken the ground beneath them. He had felt nothing. "No artillery," the voice on the radio said, panic rising. There was no sound, no muzzle flash, nothing. "Mines? We are in our dug, in positions. We haven't moved." Silence returned to the net. Al-Tikriti gripped the rim of the hatch. A tank does not simply explode. Perhaps a saboteur? A British SAS team crawling through the mud with satchel charges? That had to be it. Infantry. It was the only explanation. He grabbed the handset to order the infantry screen to deploy flares, to light up the night and catch the infiltrators. Before he could speak, the horizon to his right erupted. But it was not the horizon. It was his own line. 200 meters away, a fireball bloomed in the fog, instantly suppressed by the heavy rain, but the shockwave was unmistakable. Another T-72 tank had just died. "Contact! Contact front!" someone screamed over the net. "What do you see?" Al-Tikriti yelled. "Give me a target!" "Nothing, I see nothing." The panic was infectious. It spread through the radio waves faster than the shrapnel flying through the air. Crews were slewing their turrets frantically, their infrared searchlights cutting useless yellow cones into the thick fog. They were looking for the muzzle flashes. Every tanker knows the rule. You see the flash, you fire at the flash. But there were no flashes. It was as if the hand of God was reaching down from the storm clouds and plucking the tanks off the desert floor. To the Iraqi crews, peering through their rain-slicked periscopes, the desert before them was empty. There was no engine noise drifting over the wind. There was no silhouette of an attacking army. There was only the void. And yet, the steel was tearing. This is the story of a battle where one side was fighting a war and the other was fighting a ghost. If you want to understand the hidden history and the terrifying machinery that defined the conflicts of the late 20th century, make sure you are subscribed to Cold War Impact. We uncover the classified reality behind the headlines. The confusion inside the Tawakalna Division command post was absolute. The reports coming in were technically impossible. Company 2 is taking fire from 3 sides. I have 3 burning vehicles in Platoon 1. Where is it coming from? I don't know. There is no signature. There is no signature. Al-Tikriti dropped inside his vehicle and looked at his map. The intelligence reports from earlier that morning had placed the American heavy divisions, the 1st Infantry and the 2nd Armored, miles away to the south. They were supposed to be held up by the minefields and the burning oil trenches. They were supposed to be moving at a crawl, if they were moving at all. No army moved at night in weather like this. It was suicide. Tanks would get lost, drive into ditches, or fire on their own units. Could it be the British? The Challenger tanks? But the reports indicated the British were to the east. Another explosion shook the ground, closer this time. The smell of burning diesel and cooking ammunition began to drift into the tank. This wasn't a probe. This wasn't a special forces raid. This was a full-scale assault. But it was an assault by an invisible army. One of the surviving platoon commanders, a veteran of the siege of Basra, came over the encrypted net. His voice was eerily calm, the calm of a man who has accepted death. "Major, I am looking through the night sight. I have the IR searchlight on. There is nothing in front of me for 800 meters, but the tank next to me has just been hit by a kinetic penetrator. It went through the glacis plate and out the engine block. That shot had to come from close range. But there is no one there." "Fire into the dark," Al-Tikriti ordered, desperation clawing at his throat. "Fire suppression lanes. Sweep the sector." The darkness lit up as the remaining T-72 tanks and BMP-1 fighting vehicles began to pour fire blindly into the fog. Red tracers whipped into the nothingness. High explosive shells detonated against the sand dunes in the distance. The noise was deafening. A chaotic symphony of 125mm cannons and automatic cannon fire. "We are fighting ghosts," the gunner next to Al-Tikriti whispered. "They are spirits." "Shut up," Al-Tikriti hissed. "Load Sabo." For 5 minutes, the Iraqi line unleashed hell into the empty desert. They fired until their barrels smoked. They waited for the return fire. They waited to see the enemy tanks reveal themselves, forced to fire back and expose their positions. But the darkness did not fire back. The darkness waited. When the Iraqi firing slackened, a new sound emerged. It was not the roar of engines. It was a rhythmic, dull thudding, felt in the chest more than heard with the ears. It was the sound of heavy impacts. Not explosions, impacts. To the right, a BMP-1 vehicle simply shattered. It didn't burn immediately, it disintegrated as something traveling at hypersonic speed slammed into it. Then another. Then a T-55 tank in the reserve line. The enemy was not engaging in a firefight. They were engaging in an execution. They were firing from outside the visual range of the Iraqi optics, through the rain, through the fog, with mathematical precision. The Iraqi return fire had hit nothing. The enemy fire had hit everything. Al-Tikriti realized with a jolt of horror that his unit, the pride of the Republican Guard, was being dismantled piece by piece. They were the blind man swinging a stick in a room with a silent assassin. "Pull back!" he screamed into the radio. "Fall back to the secondary berms! Reverse!" But as the heavy diesel engines of the T-72 tanks roared to life to reverse, the massacre intensified. It was as if the movement itself triggered the enemy. As soon as a tank moved, it died. The darkness was watching. It saw the heat of the engines. It saw the movement of the tracks. "They can see us," the radio operator screamed, throwing down his headset. "By Allah, they can see us in the dark." But how? The Iraqi T-72 M1 tanks were equipped with the best Soviet night fighting technology available to the export market. They had active infrared searchlights. They had image intensifiers. If the Iraqis couldn't see through the fog, the Americans shouldn't be able to either. The laws of physics applied to everyone. Rain scatters light. Fog blocks optics. Unless the Americans weren't using light, suddenly a shape emerged from the fog. It was less than 200 meters away. It was a monstrous, angular silhouette, low to the ground, moving with a terrifying speed that defied the muddy terrain. It didn't stop to fire, it fired on the move. The main gun stabilized perfectly, floating independently of the hull's violent lurching over the dunes. A flash, finally. A muzzle flash, but it was too close. The round hit the tank next to Al-Tikriti before the sound of the shot arrived. The turret of the T-72 tank, weighing 12 tons, was sheared off and thrown into the air like a toy. The ghosts had arrived. And they were not stopping. The initial reports reaching the Iraqi general headquarters in Baghdad were dismissed as hysteria. A tank battalion claimed to be under attack by a massive armored force that was invisible. They claimed to be taking fire from ranges impossible in this weather. They claimed the enemy was moving at 30 miles per hour through mud that bogged down their own vehicles. But on the ground, amidst the burning wrecks of the Tawakalna division, there was no hysteria. There was only the cold, hard realization that the war had changed. The era of the fair fight was over. The enemy was not just better trained or better equipped. They were operating in a different dimension of reality. As Al-Tikriti watched his defensive line crumble into a chain of burning pyres, he didn't know he was witnessing the debut of a system that would render his entire military education obsolete. He didn't know about the thermal matrix or the depleted uranium. All he knew was that the fog, which he thought was his ally, had betrayed him. The Americans were not just attacking, they were hunting, and the Iraqis were the prey. 2 miles south of the burning Iraqi line, the world was not dark. It was not chaotic. It was glowing a crisp, eerie green. Inside the turret of an M1A1 Abrams tank belonging to the US 2nd Armored Division, the atmosphere was pressurized and sterile. The roar of the storm outside was reduced to a dull thrum by layers of composite armor and the high-pitched whine of the AGT-1500 turbine engine. This was not the rattling, diesel-fumed interior of a World War II Sherman or a Vietnam-era Patton. This was a spaceship on tracks. Staff Sergeant Miller, the tank commander, didn't look out of the vision blocks. There was no point. The unassisted human eye was useless in this weather. Instead, he, like his gunner, was staring into a small, flickering monitor that converted the invisible infrared spectrum into visual reality. To the naked eye, the desert was a black void of rain and mud. But on the thermal imaging screen, the desert was a high-contrast landscape of cool ground and hot metal. The rain, which was blinding the Iraqis, was actually helping the Americans. The cold water cooled the sand, creating a sharper temperature contrast with the heated engine blocks of the Iraqi armor. "Driver, move left, steady," Miller said. His voice was calm, almost bored. The intercom system filtered out the engine noise, making the crew sound like they were sitting in a living room. "Steady," the driver replied. "Contact," the gunner announced. He didn't shout, he didn't panic, he simply relayed data. Multiple hotspots. Range 2 to 1,000, 4 to 100 meters, moving right to left. On the green screen, the enemy was not a ghost. They were glaringly obvious bright white rectangles against a dark background. The thermal signature of the Soviet-made diesel engines stood out like flares. Miller could see the heat rising from their exhaust vents. He could see the heat of the gun barrels from their previous frantic firing. He could even tell which tanks were idling and which were moving. The Iraqis were over 1.5 miles away. They were completely invisible to the naked eye. In any previous war, they would have been safe. "Gunner, sabot, tank," Miller ordered. "Identified," the gunner replied. The turret hummed softly as the hydraulic stabilization system locked the 120mm smoothbore cannon onto the moving white block in the distance. The crosshairs settled on the center of the heat mass. "Up!" the loader shouted, slamming a depleted uranium dart into the breach. "Fire." On the way, the tank shuddered violently, a brief intrusion of physics into the digital game. The main gun roared, spitting a sabot round at over 3,500 miles per hour. Inside the turret, they watched the result on the screen. It took less than 2 seconds. The white rectangle on the screen didn't just stop, it bloomed. A massive white flower of heat exploded outward as the kinetic penetrator turned the T-72 tank's armor into molten spray. "Target ceases," the gunner said. "Next target, tank. 12 o'clock. Identified." It was a rhythm, a choir, Larsa, fire, kill. There was no desperate scrambling. There was no fear of return fire. They were engaging the enemy from outside the enemy's maximum effective range, at night, in a storm. It felt less like combat and more like an industrial process. The 2nd Armored Division was a factory, and its product was burning metal. But the mystery for the crew wasn't that they could see, it was what they were seeing. As the division pushed forward, crossing the phase lines, the thermal sights began to reveal a picture that didn't make sense. The intelligence briefings had predicted a regiment, maybe a dug-in battalion. But as the American tanks crested a low rise, the gunner gasped. Holy Mother! The screen was full. Stretching across the horizon, glowing white in the thermal sights, were hundreds of vehicles. Tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, supply trucks, artillery pieces. It wasn't just a unit, it was an entire mechanized ecosystem. The Tawakalna Division hadn't just set up a defensive line, they had created a killing zone, and the Americans had driven right into the middle of it. Under normal circumstances, driving a tank brigade into the center of a waiting enemy division is a tactical error that leads to annihilation. The charge of the Light Brigade, the Battle of Kursk. The side that is dug in, waiting in ambush, always wins. But the physics of war had inverted. The American column didn't stop. They didn't deploy into a defensive line. They accelerated. The doctrine was violence of action. Speed was life. If they stopped, the Iraqis might get a lucky fix on their position. If they kept moving, they remained ghosts. Outside, in the mud, the scene was surreal. The American tanks were moving at 30 miles per hour, drifting slightly in the slick mud. They were running without lights. To an observer standing on a dune, it would have looked like the storm itself was alive. The only sign of the American presence was the roar of the turbines, a high-pitched jet sound that was difficult to localize, and the sudden, thunderous cracks of the main guns. Miller watched another Iraqi tank explode on his screen. Then he saw something strange. The Iraqi turrets were turning. They were frantic. He could see the heat signature of their barrels slewing left, then right, then all the way around. They don't know where we are, Miller realized aloud. They're looking for muzzle flashes. The American propellant was smokeless. The muzzle flash was suppressed, and by the time the sound of the shot reached the Iraqi line, the American tank that fired it was already 200 yards away, swallowed by the fog. The Iraqis began to fire wildly. On the thermal screen, Miller saw the streaks of their shells. They were aiming high, aiming low, firing at imaginary shapes in the dark. It was a display of pure terror. Then, a warning tone buzzed in Miller's headset. Laser warning receiver active. He stiffened. Someone was painting them. A laser rangefinder. That meant an Iraqi tank had found them. Maybe a lucky break in the fog? Maybe a flash of lightning illuminated them? Pop smoke, Miller yelled instinctively. But the warning tone stopped as quickly as it started. Did they fire? The loader asked. No, Miller said, watching the screen. They lased us, but they didn't fire. Why? If they had the range, why not shoot? He looked closer at the thermal image of the Iraqi tank that had pointed at them. The heat signature was weird. The gun barrel was hot, but the engine deck was cooling. And then he saw the infrared spotlight atop the Iraqi turret. It was active, projecting a beam of light that was invisible to the naked eye, but shone like a lighthouse on Miller's screen. The beam was pointing at a burning truck. They're blind, Miller whispered. Their optics are washed out. The rain is scattering their IR beams. They lased us, but they got a false return from the rain. The mystery deepened. It wasn't just that the Americans had better night vision. It was that the specific frequency of the American thermal sights could penetrate the moisture in the air, while the older, active infrared systems of the Soviet-built tanks were being reflected back by the water droplets. The Iraqis were staring into a wall of white static. The Americans were staring through a clear window. It was a technological massacre. But as the Second Armored pushed deeper, the density of the enemy increased. They were now so close that the thermal sights were almost overwhelming. The sheer amount of heat from burning wrecks, from thousands of soldiers, from hundreds of engines, was starting to clutter the display. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" the platoon leader's voice crackled over the radio. "Blue on blue, watch your sectors." The formation was getting tight. In the confusion of the melee, with American tanks maneuvering around burning Iraqi hulks, the risk of friendly fire was skyrocketing. The thermal sight had a flaw. It showed heat, but it didn't show flags. A hot engine block looked like a hot engine block, whether it was a T-72 tank or an M2 Bradley fighting vehicle. "I have a target! 50 meters, directly front," the gunner shouted. Miller looked. A shape loomed in the fog, massive and boxy. It was burning hot. "Identify!" Miller screamed. "Don't shoot until you identify." "It's a tank. It's right on top of us. Wait." Miller peered at the glowing green shape. It was huge. It had a turret. It was turning toward them. His finger hovered over the override trigger. If he hesitated, they died. If he fired, he might kill his friends. The shape rotated. The thermal profile shifted. He saw the distinct, jagged outline of the road wheels. They were large, Soviet-style. "Kill it!" The blast at 50 meters was concussive. The T-72 tank, which had been lurking in a dip in the ground, erupted. The turret flew off, cartwheeling over the top of Miller's tank, landing with a ground-shaking thud behind them. They had driven right past it. The enemy was so thick, they were intermingled. This was no longer a long-range turkey shoot. This was a brawl. As the 2nd Armored Division drove deeper into the storm, the radio chatter revealed a new, unsettling development. The commanders were reporting something impossible. "I have enemy infantry. They are just standing there," one voice said. "Say again?" "They are standing in the open. They aren't taking cover. They're just watching us." Miller swung his periscope to the side. On the thermal view, he saw them. Little glowing white figures, the heat signatures of Iraqi soldiers. They weren't firing. They weren't running. They were standing by their vehicles, arms raised, or simply staring into the darkness where the roaring monsters were coming from. They had given up. The psychological impact of the invisible death had broken them. They knew they couldn't fight what they couldn't see. But not everyone was surrendering. Deep in the center of the objective, the elite core of the Republican Guard was preparing a trap. They realized that their sensors were useless. They realized that their tanks were coffins. So they switched tactics. They shut down their engines. They turned off their lights. They let the tanks go cold. On the thermal screens of the American tanks, a cold tank is almost invisible. It blends in with the cold ground. The Americans were speeding forward, confident in their magical green vision. They were hunting the hotspots. They didn't see the cold steel waiting for them in the dark. Miller's tank rolled forward, crushing a line of barbed wire. "Clear right," the loader said. "Clear left," the driver said. But directly in front of them, a dead wreck suddenly came to life. A T-72 tank, cold and silent, manually cranked its turret. There was no heat signature, no engine hum, just a dark shape in a dark storm. The Americans had become so reliant on their technology that they had forgotten the oldest rule of war: the enemy adapts. The shell from the dead T-72 tank screamed over the turret of Staff Sergeant Miller's Abrams, missing the commander's independent thermal viewer by inches. The shockwave slapped the side of the American tank like a physical hand, ringing the hull like a bell. "Contact! Contact left! Close range!" Miller screamed, his voice cracking. "I can't see him," the gunner yelled back. "No signature. He's cold." On the green screen, the enemy tank was invisible. Its engine had been off for an hour. Its tracks were the same temperature as the mud. It was a black hole in the thermal landscape. The only reason they knew it was there was the blinding flash of its muzzle, which bloomed and vanished in a microsecond, leaving the American gunner staring at a wall of static. The technological miracle had just become a trap. The Americans had trained to hunt heat. They were predators looking for the blood warmth of engines. But the prey had stopped breathing. "Coax! Traverse left! Spray the area!" Miller ordered, abandoning the precision of the main gun for the chaotic suppression of the machine gun. The turret slewed. The coaxial machine gun ripped into the darkness, tracers tearing through the fog. Sparks flew as the rounds walked onto the steel hull of the lurking T-72 tank. The friction of the bullets hitting the armor created heat, artificial heat. "I see him!" the gunner shouted. The friction had painted the enemy tank in a ghostly outline of thermal energy. "Lacing!" The main gun fired at point-blank range. The distance was less than 100 meters. The sabot round didn't even have time to discard its petals completely before it slammed into the turret ring of the Iraqi tank. The explosion was immediate and catastrophic, blowing the turret clear off the chassis. But the ambush wasn't over. It was spreading. All across the line of objective Norfolk, the zombie tactic was taking its toll. The Iraqi Republican Guard commanders, realizing they were being slaughtered in a long-range duel, had ordered their units to hold fire, cut engines, and wait. They turned the battlefield into a minefield of sleeping steel. To the south, A platoon of M2 Bradley fighting vehicles rolled past a cluster of burning trucks. They were scanning the horizon for deep targets. They didn't notice the 3 T-55 tanks parked in the defilade right next to the burning wreckage. The fire from the trucks masked the heat of the tanks. As the lead Bradley passed, the T-55 tanks opened fire. The resulting melee was a scene of pure, unadulterated chaos. The orderly, video game-like destruction of the previous hour evaporated. This was a street fight in the middle of nowhere. Bradleys unleashed their 25mm Bushmaster cannons, the chainsaws of light soaring through the optics and tracks of the heavier Iraqi tanks. Tau missiles were fired at ranges so short the guidance wires barely had time to unspool. An American company commander's voice cut through the radio net, calm but urgent. All units, switch to auxiliary sites if thermal is unclear. Watch for silhouettes. They are playing dead. Repeat. The enemy is playing dead. The psychological strain shifted. The American crews, previously feeling invincible inside their high-tech cocoons, suddenly felt exposed. Every shadow, every mound of dirt, every wrecked truck could be a T-72 tank waiting to put a 125mm round through their flank. The feeling of being the hunter vanished. They were now walking through a graveyard where the corpses might sit up and shoot. Al-Tikriti, miraculously alive in a command bunker dug into the sand, listened to the screams of his men on the radio. He realized the Americans were not stopping. They were driving through his division. They weren't flanking. They were crushing the center. He grabbed an RPG-7 launcher from a dead soldier and crawled up the muddy berm. The rain was torrential now, washing the blood into the sand. He peered over the edge. The sight was apocalyptic. The fog was lit from within by hundreds of burning fires. It looked like a city skyline at night, but the lights were burning vehicles. Through this inferno, the American tanks moved like sharks. They didn't slow down for the wreckage. They drove over it. He watched an M1A1 Abrams tank plow through a burning truck, emerging from the flames with fire dripping from its tracks, its turret turning relentlessly to find the next target. Al-Tikriti raised the RPG. He aimed at the side skirt of the passing monster. He knew it was futile. The RPG warhead would likely bounce off the Chobham armor, but he had to do something. He squeezed the trigger. The rocket whooshed out, spiraling erratically in the wind. It struck the tracks of the Abrams. There was a flash, a puff of smoke. The tank didn't even stop. It didn't turn. It simply kept rolling, the massive tracks grinding the mud, ignoring the sting. "They are not men," Al-Tikriti whispered, dropping the launcher. "They are machines." The chaos reached its peak around 0400 hours. The sheer density of the combatants led to a new horror: friendly fire. In the green, glowing world of the thermal sights, identification was difficult. A hot tank looked like a hot tank. The heat signature of an M1A1 Abrams engine exhaust was different from a T-72 tank, but in the heat of battle, with adrenaline pumping and turrets spinning, mistakes happened. "Ceasefire! Ceasefire! You are shooting at blue!" "Negative. Target is Soviet profile." "Check your fire! Check your fire!" Tracers from American machine guns crossed paths. An American anti-tank missile slammed into the turret of an American Bradley. The fratricide was the only thing slowing the advance. The enemy was helpless, but the Americans were becoming a danger to themselves because of the sheer speed of their violence. But amidst this confusion, a strange phenomenon began to emerge. As the 2nd Armored Division pushed out the other side of the objective, leaving the burning ruin of the Tawakalna Division behind them, the radio chatter changed again. It wasn't about combat anymore. It was about loot. Not gold or money. Intelligence. "Command, this is Bravo 2-6. We are at the rear of the enemy logistics train. You're not going to believe what we found." "Go ahead, 2-6. "We found a command vehicle. Tracks intact. Engine running. But it's empty. The doors are open. There's tea still hot on the table. Maps are spread out." "Did they flee?" "It looks like they vanished, sir. But that's not the weird part." "What is it?" "The maps. I'm looking at their operational map, sir. They don't have us on it." "Clarify." "There are no red markers for our division. They have the British 1st Armoured to the east. They have the Marines to the south. But right here, where we just drove through, it's blank. They didn't know we were here until we started shooting." "But wait. There's something else sketched on the map. In the sector north of us, a circle, marked in red ink. What is the label?" "It's in Arabic. I think it says, the Iron Sanctuary. The fighting began to die down as the sun threatened to rise. The fog began to thin, turning from a black shroud to a grey mist. The battlefield of Objective Norfolk was revealed in the grey morning light. It was a junkyard of history. Hundreds of Iraqi armoured vehicles lay smoking, turrets blown off, hulls shattered. The ground was churned into a sea of black mud and oil. But the mystery of the Iron Sanctuary lingered. What was north of them? The Americans had destroyed the Tawakalna division. They had broken the back of the Republican Guard's heavy armor. But as they consolidated their positions, looking north into the receding fog, the thermal sights picked up something new. It wasn't a tank, it wasn't a truck. It was a heat signature. But it was massive. It was a continuous line of heat, stretching for miles, bubbling up from the ground itself. Staff Sergeant Miller popped the hatch of his tank for the first time in 6 hours. The air smelled of sulfur and wet ash. He put his binoculars to his eyes and looked north, towards the strange heat signature. "What is that?" his loader asked, poking his head out. "Is that a fire trench?" Miller focused the lenses. "No," he said slowly. "It's not a trench." The fog swirled, revealing a glimpse of the anomaly. It looked like a wall, a physical wall of earth and concrete, stretching across the desert floor, but the heat wasn't coming from the wall. It was coming from behind it. And then, the ground began to vibrate. Not the sharp shock of artillery, but a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from the center of the earth. "Seismic sensors are spiking," the driver called up. "Something big is moving, and it's coming from the sanctuary." The Americans had won the battle of the night. They had defeated the ghosts in the fog, but they had just knocked on the door of something they weren't supposed to find. The map in the abandoned command vehicle hadn't been marking a defensive position. It was marking a storage site, and the doors were opening. The ground didn't just shake, it rippled. Staff Sergeant Miller gripped the commander's override handle as the vibrations rattled the teeth of everyone inside the turret. The heat source, to the north, the anomaly behind the Iron Sanctuary, was not a biological monster, nor was it a secret Iraqi superweapon. It was a man-made earthquake. "Look at the thermal!" the gunner shouted, his voice tinged with awe. "The ground! The ground is exploding!" On the green screen, a linear chain of massive, white-hot eruptions was tearing the desert floor apart. These were not artillery shells. They were Miklik's mine-clearing line charges. The monster that the Iraqi map had labeled the Iron Sanctuary was not a bunker complex. It was the designated kill zone where the Iraqi commanders believed no army could pass. It was a region of dense minefields, anti-tank ditches, and berms, designed to funnel any attacker into a narrow choke point where the Republican Guard could slaughter them. They had built a sanctuary of safety behind a wall of death. But the Americans weren't funneling, they were kicking down the wall. The seismic rumbling was the sound of the US 1st Infantry Division, the big red one breaching the minefields to the north. They were firing rockets tethered to thousands of pounds of C4 explosives, laying them across the minefields like rolled-out carpets of death, and detonating them. The explosions triggered the mines, cleared the wire, and leveled the berms. The doors were opening, but they weren't opening for the Iraqis to escape. They were opening to let the rest of the avalanche in. As the sun finally began to bleed through the thinning fog, turning the grey mist into a blinding, diffuse white light, the full scope of what had happened that night became visible, and it was terrifying. Staff Sergeant Miller popped his hatch and stood up. The air was cold, damp, and smelled of something distinct, not just burning diesel, but the metallic, coppery taste of pulverized steel. "My God," he whispered. The Iron Sanctuary was a graveyard. For as far as the eye could see, the desert was littered with the black, smouldering skeletons of the Tawakalna division. It wasn't just a few tanks, it was an industrial landscape of destruction. T-72 tanks sat with their turrets stabbed into the sand like lollipops dropped by a giant. BMP fighting vehicles were melted down to their road wheels. Supply trucks were nothing but frame rails and ash. But the most shocking part was the formation. The Iraqi tanks were pointing south. They were in their battle positions. They hadn't run. They hadn't panicked. They had died exactly where they stood, waiting for an enemy they never saw. They had vanished, not by fleeing, but by being erased from the timeline so quickly that they didn't even have time to traverse their guns. This brings us to the true reveal, the secret mechanism that allowed the US 2nd Armored Division to pull off this impossible magic trick. It wasn't just the thermal sights. It wasn't the depleted uranium. It was a small, quiet box sitting next to Miller's knee. A box that the Iraqi military intelligence didn't even know existed in a miniaturized form. The SLGR, small lightweight GPS receiver. To understand why this is the shock, you have to understand the Iraqi strategy. Major al-Tikriti and the Republican Guard Command had bet their entire existence on the desert itself. They knew the terrain of the Mutla Ridge, and the open desert was featureless. In a sandstorm or heavy fog, without landmarks, navigation is impossible. You drift. You get lost. You separate. The Iraqis assumed that any American attack at night and in a storm would have to move slowly, using compasses and counting odometer clicks. They assumed the Americans would have to stop constantly to reorient. They assumed the Americans would have to use the roads or known tracks. So, the Iraqis pointed their guns at the roads. They pointed their guns at the natural choke points. They built their iron sanctuary, assuming the Americans were blind. But the Americans were navigating by satellite. The Slugger GPS units allowed the US tanks to move through the trackless, featureless desert in the middle of a pitch-black storm at full combat speed with an error margin of less than 10 meters. They didn't need roads. They didn't need landmarks. The desert, which was supposed to be the Iraqi shield, became a 6-lane highway for the Americans. The ghosts that al-Tikriti had feared were simply men who knew exactly where they were on the planet, down to the inch, while he was lost in his own backyard. As the morning light fully illuminated the battlefield, Miller's tank rolled past the wreckage of the command bunker where al-Tikriti had made his last stand. The bunker was shattered. Papers were blowing across the sand. An intelligence officer, a captain from the divisional HQ, was already there, sifting through the debris. Miller hopped down from his tank to stretch his legs, his boots sinking into the oil-soaked mud. "Find anything, Captain?" Miller asked. The captain held up a map. It was scorched at the edges. "This is their operational assessment," the captain said, shaking his head. "Look at this." He pointed to a frantic scribble made in red grease pencil across the sector the Americans had just traversed. The Arabic script was jagged, written in a hurried hand. "What does it say?" Miller asked. "It translates roughly to, 'The jinn come from the silence.'" Jinn? Spirits. Demons. The captain looked out over the field of burning steel. "They thought we were supernatural. They couldn't comprehend how we moved. We captured a colonel a few miles back. You know what he asked me? He didn't ask about our tank numbers. He didn't ask about our air support. He asked, 'How did you see the stars in the storm?'" Miller looked back at his tank. The ugly, angular slab of Chobham armor, the complex optics, the GPS antenna. "We didn't need the stars," Miller said. "We brought our own." But the mystery of the vanishing had one final grim layer. As the cleanup crews moved in, they realized why the casualty counts were so confusing. The Iraqi divisions had thousands of men. Yet, the number of prisoners was low, and the number of visible bodies didn't match the scale of the destruction. Where were the crews? The answer lay inside the tanks. The heat of the depleted uranium penetrators, combined with the catastrophic detonation of the Soviet-made autoloaders, which stored ammunition in a carousel right beneath the crew, had created a thermal event so intense that it vaporized the organic matter inside. The crews hadn't fled. They hadn't been buried. They had been converted into carbon and ash, fused with the steel of the machines they loved. The vanishing was literal. The violence of the kinetic energy weapon was so absolute that it left nothing behind to bury. In the span of 100 hours, the fourth largest army in the world, battle-hardened by a decade of war with Iran, had not just been defeated, it had been rendered technologically irrelevant. The Battle of Norfolk, specifically this night attack by the 2nd Armored Division, marked the end of an era. For thousands of years, fog, rain, and darkness were the great equalizers in war. They were the friends of the defender. They slowed armies down. They hid the weak from the strong. On February 26, 1991, that ended. Technology had killed the fog of war. The US Army had proven that it could see through the dark, navigate through the void, and kill without being seen. As Miller climbed back into his turret, he looked one last time at the devastation. The silence was returning to the desert. The storm had passed. The iron sanctuary was broken open, its secrets laid bare under the harsh sun. He keyed the radio. "Driver, move out, north. We aren't done yet." The tank lurched forward, leaving the graveyard of the Republican Guard behind. They were ghosts no longer. They were the new masters of the battlefield, and the world would never be the same. The Iraqi divisions didn't vanish in the fog. They vanished because they were fighting a war of the past against an enemy from the future.